Consumption of 5 billion tons of coal, 31 billion barrels of oil, nearly 3 trillion cubic feet of gas, and 65,000 tons of uranium can be equaled by 6,600 tons of thorium properly burned. What I'd like to say is what Mr. Lamb was mentioning earlier about many of the issues with safety, I will get into later. And I would like to talk about how abundant this energy source is for the world and how conflict energy will be a thing of the past if we approach it sensibly. One ton, 1 gigawatt, one city is all it takes to power. It has a low cost. It's a proven technology. It was developed in Oak Ridge National Labs in the 1960s and ran for 20,000 hours. Ironically, it was set to be on a nuclear bomber during the Cold War because it was so compact. The issue is that it wasn't viable for making nuclear weapons. We're talking safety issues with nuclear power plants. This is low pressure, high temperature reactor. It's a molten salt. It has a roughly 1,000 centigrade operating temperature range of its molten nature. It can't run away, it can't melt down, it can't blow up. Doesn't need $1 billion containment building. It's efficient. It burns 99% of its fuel versus 1% on a solid fuel rod system. Has very little byproducts. We're talking a couple of decades for majority of its waste stream versus hundreds of thousands of years. Because it's high heat, it can be very compact generation sets. It can burn our nuclear waste. MIT's Transatomic is just got an energy award for a waste annihilation reactor system. Thorium can burn our nuclear waste. It's carbon-free energy, of course. It has the heat properties to convert garbage, biofuels, and in a conversation with the chief chemist from the Naval Research Lab, they're working on a process of making jet fuel for their aircraft carriers out of seawater. Actually taking the CO2 out of the water and converting it, cracking the water and making jet fuel and doing it at a lower cost than they can deliver it to their ships. It has magnitudes less waste. For uranium reactor, you're talking 800,000 tons of ore mining versus 200 tons with thorium. You're talking huge waste streams with uranium versus thorium. It must be looked at. It can be built modular in the 50, 100 megawatt range, which means you can put it where the power needs to be. You could do desalination and power for coastal cities instead of having to have large generating plants and do massive distribution systems. And they can be built much quicker. In terms of 2 to 3 years range from one Canadian firm. Full disclosure, I represent Thorium Power Canada that is looking for the funding to do its first demonstration plant in the next 2 to 3 years. They can be built on assembly lines just like Boeing builds a commercial airliner, which is a highly complex machine. It can be very inexpensive to deploy, good payback. And one of the ironies of this technology is during the Cold War, it was put on the shelf at Oak Ridge National Labs because it wasn't a good source of bomb-making material. You had to go through way too many steps than what you can do with a typical fission reaction with uranium. It's a fertile material, it's not a fissile material. So you're dealing with a system that can't melt down, can't blow up. There's tons of it everywhere in the world, thousands of years of sustainability. And what I'm hoping to get out of this session is to be invited back with a full technical team to get into depth on the technology, and also to hopefully change California policy for the thorium lifter to be considered a sustainable energy source and a good energy source. And the walkaway safety issue on this technology is it's a gravity-fed freeze plug system. So if the power goes out, the freeze plug melts and it drains away to safety tanks. This was all worked out in the 1960s at Oak Ridge. So how I see this tying into California is we led the world with building the Transcontinental Railroad and locomotive construction, and now we're lagging behind and building high-speed rail. We've done electrification in California with the power plant in Folsom, and now we're shutting down all of our nuclear plants. What's next? We've lost the photovoltaic market to China. We're building an expensive water project that will not create a drop of water. I'm suggesting that we look at thorium lifter to not only generate power, but provide desalination for Southern California. And let's see. I think that is the majority of my comments. I welcome any questions.
Okay, well, thanks. I think we talked before, obviously, I was thinking back to, I guess, the Chip Up's book, back when people, was the Lightwater Dream, I think it was called.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was sort of, there were a variety of fuel cycles we could have picked and invested in, but we picked the one we did. And
unfortunately.
Yeah, that may or may not be, but it is one of those questions of whether nuclear would ever have a second chance in that sense. So there's certainly people looking at that. Thinking also back to the two Harvard MIT studies, again, it's saying, how do we marginally improve what we're doing as opposed to striking out, basically striking out a whole new path. Although I guess you've gotten some money from ARPA in this area.
Well,
it's probably the most likely venue for.
Well, China's on a crash $2 billion program with 180 PhDs working on shared DOE plans on the Oak Ridge work.
I thought India also really focused on thorium, given its materials.
I think it's so abundant. I think they're trying to start with their solid fuel reactors and then build towards the later phases. Norway's getting into it big time. I also think UK is seriously looking at it now.
Where are the major deposits of thorium? You said it was very prevalent, but
everywhere. It's as common as lead. There's enough thorium to power our society at highly accelerated levels for thousands of years. You just can't run out of the stuff.
Is there prototype or demonstration project actually in place anywhere?
There's a mothballed facility at Oak Ridge National Lab that ran for 20,000 hours. It was a test bed for a nuclear bomber powered by a nuclear power plant. And it lost out to the Polaris submarine missile platform during the Cold War. And since it wasn't able to really produce any nuclear weapons out of it during the Cold War, there wasn't really an issue to, a need to throw money at a great power source.
So you're saying that the downside of this technology is that it can't produce bomb-making material?
Yes. And it will also burn our nuclear waste from our plants.
So maybe I missed something on the technical side. So basically, it's not since it's not a fission basis, it's basically producing lots of heat to run a steam cycle, or
Well, it's a fertile material, not a fissile material. So it needs a starter seed of uranium to start creating neutrons that convert it into 235.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Finally, our last panel is a public interest panel discussion with Rochelle Becker, of Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility, and Kendra Ulrich with Friends of the Earth.
Thanks for coming. First up.
Commissioners, Chair, first I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here. I have to say, when I received the invitation from Joan Walters to be here, I had a very different idea of what I would be speaking to you about. Changed drastically on June 7th. As you know, our interest has been primarily San Onofre here in the state. First, I just want to applaud the CEC for your leadership and forward thinking in calling for a Plan B for a Southern California without San Onofre. I also just want to say, as my dear friend and colleague Dave Freeman has said frequently, that California is no longer one power plant away from rolling blackouts. And I think that San Onofre really demonstrates the fact that, the ISO, the PUC, the CEC has been able to respond very rapidly to the loss of a major power plant, and last summer and this summer really demonstrate the fact that we don't need these incredibly centralized, dirty, and dangerous old nuclear facilities. Just want to first give a brief overview of FOE's role in the San Onofre issue. As you know, we have been engaged at both at the PUC in both the OII investigation as well as in the long-term procurement proceeding. As far as the NRC is concerned, we had filed a petition almost a year ago that contended that both the restart plan as well as back when these steam generators, drastically redesigned steam generators, were replaced, that Southern California Edison should have been required to go through the license amendment process. On November 8th, the NRC commissioners voted unanimously to defer this to the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board, as well as to a 2206 petition process. The Atomic Safety and Licensing Board is a panel of judges comprised of scientists, of engineers, and of lawyers that took a look at the facts that we presented and summarily rejected both the NRC staff's opinion as well as SCE's contentions and upheld all of Friends of the Earth contentions. What they said was that these were not like-for-like replacements, that these were drastically different replacement equipment, that restart was in fact a nuclear experiment, and that this was in fact a de facto license amendment process. That was on the 13th of May. 3 weeks later, San Onofre, Ted Graber announced that they were shutting down San Onofre, citing the ASLB decision as the decisive factor in that decision. Now, I just want to say that this isn't a case of regulation overburdening a utility. This is a case in which the facts were weighed by technical staff, by engineers and by scientists, based upon the technical evidence that Friends of the Earth had been able to submit due to our expert consultants that said that this is in fact an experiment with Southern California. So we're absolutely delighted that it is shut down. As far as San Onofre going forward, we just want to say that we fully support the CEC's position that the spent fuel pools are overpacked, that they need to be thinned as quickly as possible, and in the case of San Onofre, that the spent fuel needs to be transferred into dry cask storage and hardened on-site storage as quickly as possible, and that's just from a public safety perspective that needs to happen. As far as San Onofre and national implications, we keep hearing from the nuclear industry that this is, an isolated situation. Really, 2012 has been kind of a bellwether year that is indicative of a nuclear renaissance that was dead on arrival. We've seen the shutdown of 4 nuclear power plants, San Onofre units 2 and 3, Kewaunee in Wisconsin, and Crystal River in Florida. Kewaunee shut down because it was non-competitive. It was a small merchant reactor that is non-competitive and is likely to be the first of many around the country that will be shut down. Crystal River and San Onofre units 2 and 3 were shut down because of utilities that cut corners in the interest of money and in the interest of time. And so as we move forward, what we're seeing is an aging nuclear fleet in this country that is dealing with the problems of any technology that is 4 decades old and equipment that is 3 to 4 decades old, generally speaking. And as they're trying to replace and repair this old archaic equipment and old archaic technology, we're seeing a lot of problems, and obviously they're trying to minimize the costs and the burdens. We heard a lot today about Fukushima retrofits. These are retrofits that are going to cause extended outages going forward as they're trying to invest ratepayer money, generally speaking, into bringing these old buildings, old equipment, old technology up to date, which really, from our perspective, needs to be invested in clean, renewable energy technologies, transmission upgrades to support that. With San Onofre shut down, Southern California is certainly poised to be an example of that transition. And here in California, where you're already on a trajectory for 33% renewables, with the governor calling for an increase to 40% renewable energy, we definitely see that firmly underway, that process, that transition. But what we will need is for the CEC to show that leadership and to steward responsible decisions to pivot away from fossil fuels and pivot away from these old dirty technologies to energy efficiency, energy storage, and clean renewable technologies. So with that, I want to say thank you again, and if you have any questions about the work that we did on San Onofre, I'd be happy to answer that.
Thanks very much for being here. Ms. Helfer. Any questions?
Yeah, just a question on the issue of thinning out the spent fuel pools and moving to dry cask. Edison indicated this morning that they thought it would be 7 to 12 years before the assemblies could be, the last one into the pool could be taken out. Do you have any different information, or do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, the time frame for cooling fuel that's recently been removed is 5 to 7 years. Obviously, these spent fuel pools are packed with fuel that's been in them for quite a long time that can be quickly removed. With San Onofre shut down, the nuclear threat in California is definitely reduced. But we've got 1,200 tons of high-level waste on site in a seismic zone in highly vulnerable spent fuel pools. And so in the interest of public safety, like what we're seeing at Fukushima, the spent fuel pool is a crisis at these reactors in Fukushima. And we certainly don't want to still have that kind of nuclear threat sitting on the shores in between 2 of the largest cities in the state.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Actually,
Actually, before I begin, I was wondering if Kendra might mention your ASLB petition, because I'd like to have the Energy Commission support that, but I'd like you to explain it, so.
Sure. So that's the petition that I was talking about earlier. Was the petition that we filed on June 18th last year with the NRC. Was deferred on November 8th into two different processes. One before the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board, that was looking at the restart plan, and one before a petition review board, which is a 2206 petition. The Atomic Safety and Licensing Board was looking specifically at the NRC's confirmatory action letter. So this was their return to service conditions that they had to comply with in order to get NRC approval for restart. The problem at San Onofre was that the equipment was so severely damaged and so drastically different that they couldn't comply with the terms of the CAL while still in compliance with their license. So our contention was that this is in fact a de facto license amendment process which entitles the public to a public hearing. The Atomic Safety and Licensing Board agreed with that wholly. As I said before, these were not like-for-like replacements. That this was in fact a nuclear experiment and that this was in fact a de facto license amendment process which required the public hearing. Edison, in the face of actually having to go through the proper regulatory process, Edison chose to shut down instead. But the fact remains that if they had had to go through this process before, many of these design flaws would have likely been caught. And unfortunately, the lives and livelihoods of 8.7 million people were unnecessarily jeopardized for the time that the reactors were operating without defective equipment in place.
Thanks. Can I ask a question about,
So, no, I was going to say, I did file a statement at the NRC, and the points we made were, one, before the decision of Edison to shut down, one was that the NRC had to determine it was safe before it was restarted, and two, that there had to be a public process to basically review that. I did not get into all the intricacies of the different procedural aspects at the NRC. And frankly, I know my own procedural stuff here, but I'm always hesitant to jump into another commission that has a pretty intricate legal system and take a guess on what's the best mechanism there.
Sure. And I just want to say that I did see your comments, and we very much appreciated the state weighing in and saying that safety needs to be put first and public process needs to be put first. And that's really the case in the state of California as well as throughout the country.
so that's a good segue to my last question here. So does, on the spent fuel issue and sort of the local issues around San Onofre, how does that link to any work that you're doing at the federal level on the fuel issue more generally? This is not just a problem at this one plant, but it's one of the perennial problems here for the nuclear industry. So just any comments you have about that and what the path you're working on actually is?
Well, our position right now, because the spent fuel issue is a problem nationally, as you mentioned, but it's also a decades-old problem where the nuclear industry has been waiting around for some fantasy permanent solution while packing spent fuel pools, saying that eventually someday there's going to be a final repository for this stuff. Our position is that at the present moment, the safest possible thing is hard and on-site storage without transferring, high-level waste on the nation's highways, et cetera, at this point. So our position is that it needs to be secured on-site.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad to close this very long day and actually a very long road for many of us. Many of the questions and the issues brought forth today are questions and issues that were brought forth in the 1980s when my face was younger than that face there. So it's nice to see the young face, and it's nice to hear us really seriously talking about some of these issues. A bit too late, but better late than never. I started with the Energy Commission in 2005, testifying as a public voice. I have probably been the only consistent public voice at every one of your IPERs, and will continue to be so until we have no more nuclear plants in California, because we can't afford them. However, there were some issues that were brought forth today that I find rather puzzling. PG&E said that they were quite prepared if there was a seismic event on site. Well, most of my community does not live on site. And if they are concerned about roads and bridges not being available to them, you can imagine how we feel about roads and bridges not being available to us. When they first wanted to license Diablo Canyon, we asked them to consider an earthquake and a radioactive release at a nuclear power plant. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission told us, no, that was too remote and speculative. There might be a radioactive release, and there might be an earthquake that could affect bridges and roads, but the two would not happen. Many lessons have been learned, and that is one of them. But that doesn't help the community. The costs are our consideration. I haven't passed in my comments yet because I didn't want you to be looking at my comments when I spoke. I wanted you to mostly be looking at something that looks like this. Big enough? It's a dollar sign.
Should we have you submit that to the record?
I'm not an artist, but I'm pretty sure most of us recognize it. The original price estimates, about $300 million. Final price tag under construction, $5.7 billion. What we've heard today are a lot of things that PG&E is doing to make sure that plant's safe. But PG&E doesn't plan on paying for those. They plan on passing those on to ratepayers. And ratepayers' pockets are virtually empty. I'm lucky enough to pay rates for both SDG&E and PG&E. So my rates are going to be higher for both nuclear power plants for questions that I asked the state to address in the 1980s. Last week, 2 days before the SCE decided to retire their nuclear power plants, Friends of the Earth brought former Chairman Yasko to San Diego. And he had some really interesting words, and we will link his tape to our testimony so you can hear what he had to say. I listened very carefully when he was talking because I was looking for certain things. And I was looking for things that went somewhat like, quote, over the years we began to rely more and more on the fact that things were not likely to happen. And as a result, we didn't need to spend money to address them. Clearly, the accident at Fukushima told us otherwise. A recent assessment that was done by the American Nuclear Society, which is a very important, credible organization made up of nuclear professionals, estimated in a report that they did following an accident that the overall costs, including economic costs, loss of activity, and loss of valuable use of land, is approximately $500 billion. We can't afford that. I don't know what replacement power will cost, but I do know it won't cost $500 billion. We are facing people that cannot return to their homes. We are facing millions of tons of radioactive water and soil that they don't know what to do with. And Diablo Canyon lives on the same Pacific Rim, just the other side. And there's no less seismic activity on our side of the Pacific Rim than there is on Japan's side of the Pacific Rim. These are important questions. And they have impacts to our lives, and they have impacts to our livelihoods. Not just the people sitting in this room, because many of us are getting older, but our children and our grandchildren, long after that last megawatt blows out of that plant, as we're learning at San Onofre, we're going to be paying for power that we're no longer getting. We need to consider the full lifetime costs of nuclear power. We needed to consider them in the 1980s. We've had many heads up, and the next heads up could be California, and then it's too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate all your efforts through the years. That consistency helps our process.
The institutional memory is getting older, guys. Get ready.
I have to say, all this discussion about middle age is sort of hitting home with me, so, hopefully.
Look to your right and look to
So
your
we're only
left.
talking about nuclear plants, right? Great. So I'll pass it back to Suzanne to keep us moving ahead here. Thanks very much for being here.
All right, now the moment all you folks have been waiting for, it's our public comment time. I've got several blue cards here to, I'm sorry. Okay, our first commenter is Ben Davis. Please remember, we're trying to keep comments to 3 minutes so that everybody has a chance to talk.